Good morning, everybody. Everybody might be just me. We'll wait a couple minutes here before we start. I'm just making sure things are working. Coming to you from a new location today. I think that'll work. Hey, good morning, Merle. All right. Well, we are at 7:30, and I see there's actually a few people logged on, so that's nice. Thanks, everyone. So, good morning. Welcome to. I can't believe this, but this is the first episode of season 5 of Ask the Agronomist, and kind of cool. I'm here at the Learning Center in Monmouth, so kind of coming full circle. I used to do a lot of when the Learning Center was running here at Monmouth. Used to do a lot of live meetings and live trainings here at Monmouth. We still do some of that kind of stuff here, but not near like we did when we had the Learning Center. But back then, when Troy Kazire was here, if Troy happens to be watching this morning, he's going to be very jealous that I'm doing Ask the Agronomist live from Monmouth, because when Troy was here, the internet that we had, the network, the Monsanto network at that time that we had here at the research farm, was not compatible with YouTube Live. So we actually could not do the program live from Monmouth here. And so over the years, I have, been many places. Kind of for the past few years, our standard home has been a dealer location south of Macomb, and that worked well. We were occasionally in their way, but it was a nice facility, had good internet, and really all I need for Ask the Agronomist is good stable internet and a semi-private room, and I'll be good. Now, nice to have a nice board here behind me, and the guys at Nutrient and Macomb bought a billboard sized dry erase board for me to use. So that was very nice of them to do that. But anyway, they've got some new guest internet here at Monmouth that does not require a bare device to log in, and so another more information than you care to know. I also can't use a bare computer to connect to YouTube Live because they're worried about what I'm doing on YouTube Live, I guess. So so we had a dealer that purchased this laptop that I use to do Ask the Agronomist. So here at Monmouth, can't use a Bear device to do YouTube live stuff. And in the past, you could not connect to the internet here with anything but a Bear device. But that has changed. And if this works, I think the research center here will probably become my standard home base for doing Ask the Agronomist. I still want to travel. I still want to get out. I still want to do remotes. I still want to be at other locations from time to time. But there's a really nice small conference room here that's just perfect. Got a nice dry erase board. Got a door on it. It's even got a lock on it. I could lock the door if I wanted to, just to keep anybody from poking their head in here in the room while we're live. So anyway, we'll you can give me feedback on how this works. Right now seems to be good. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. And I guess one thing first, I want to do this before I forget. Today happens to be my dad's birthday, so happy birthday, Pop! We're going out for dinner tonight. I can't believe my dad is 78 today. That's I feel old. He feels older. So if your dad's still around, great, and I hope you're enjoying him. So I plan to enjoy some time with my dad later today. But I'm just going to go through. I got kind of a list here of notes. May not get through the whole thing. We'll probably deviate from the list. If you have questions, please chat them in. Now, I am solo here this morning, so it's a little bit harder for me to keep up with stuff in the chat when I don't have Adam here to help me. And that's one downside of moving it to Monmouth. That makes it most days probably too far away for Adam to get to make sense for him to join me here. So he is actually logged into the chat from his office for a time. Then he's got to get on the road here in a bit. But if you have a question, please chat it in. As long as Adam's here, he'll make sure that I don't miss it. And I will try to keep my eye on the chat. I can see the chat from where I'm at. I just can't really type anything into it or interact with you. But if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. And what I'm going to plan on doing today is primarily what I consider to be some of the key learnings, observations from the 2024 growing season. And as we go, we'll kind of talk about which ones maybe have some sort of validity for 25 and beyond, and which ones maybe we should not pay a lot of attention to. The old saying, every year is different, is reproved to us every year that every year is different. And the silly part of that is, in some ways, every year we're surprised that every year is different. And if there's one thing in production agriculture or environmental science or agronomy or whatever, any discipline that interacts with the weather and the climate and the environment, it should not be a surprise that every year is different, because every year is going to be different forever. No 2 years are years are like snowflakes. No two are created the same. So it should be an established, accepted fact, never a surprise, that every year is different. But each year is different in its own way. So I guess the first thing I kind of when I started this list, I was going in chronological order. I'm not sure I stayed with chronological order as we went, but the first thing I made note of was that early planting dates shined in 2024, probably more than I can ever remember. Both corn and soybeans. The yield benefits to planting early were huge, and the problems that sometimes are associated with planting early were not really relevant or prevalent this past growing season. So what typically happens is, late planted crops suffer. Sometimes the early planted crops suffer, and a lot of times the sweet stuff somewhere in the middle. Well, this year it was more of a straight line decline, and every 2 or 3 days delay in planting in either crop from late March on resulted in measurable yield loss in both crops. On the average, there's exceptions to every rule, of course, But this was a very good year to be ready to roll. That first window of opportunity, and a lot of people had an early April window. In some parts of the state, the early April window actually started in March, and a lot of us really, maybe aren't comfortable planting that early, and we waited, and we had more good windows through April. Some people were more aggressive in those good windows than others, and generally speaking, for a whole host of reasons, and my reasons why early planting was so good in 24 was um, some of the problems that are sometimes associated with early planting, such as crown rot in corn and diseases like SDS in soybeans, were not terribly prevalent in 24. SDS was to a certain extent, but not horribly bad. And crown rot in corn was almost a non-issue in 24, and that gave a huge advantage to the really early planted corn. And we'll talk a little bit as we go why I think crown rot was so low pressure in 2024. The second thing I would mention is the summer got dry towards the end. So we started wet, we got dry in June. About the third year in a row we've been dry in June, and dry Junes can be good for several things if you don't take it too far. In 23 and 22, in some cases, the dry June was dry to the point of about to cause a problem. 24's dry June was not as severely dry as 22 and 23 was. But then we had good moisture in July, which is largely responsible for as good as the crops were in 24. And then it got really dry in August and September in a lot of the state. And the later planted crops were still determining yield in August and early September. And we had a flash drought in a lot of areas during that time frame, and that really impacted those later planted crops more, both corn and soybeans. And then in the case of corn, obviously there's been a lot of talk about aphids. We'll talk a little bit more about aphids as we get along here today. But aphids were absolutely a big factor in the later planted corn. About the latest planting date I've seen that was not impacted by aphids was May 3rd, May 4th. Then there wasn't. There was very little corn planted in May prior to Mother's Day weekend. By Mother's Day weekend, aphids were really, really, really active in that Mother's Day weekend and later planted corn. Basically, anything that got planted before Mother's Day weekend, pretty well not a non-event for aphids. So that was a big factor, especially in corn, not really so much in soybeans. I would also say that disease pressure in corn in particular was relatively low this year. We had some foliar disease come in late. I think the foliar diseases got a late start, especially tar spot, because of the dry June. This is the third year in a row. The last year that we had a wet June was 2021, which was the year that we had bad tar spot, bad crown rot, bad southern rust, and lots of horrible plant health issues in corn. Since then, the corn crop's been relatively healthy, and we've had some pretty high yielding years. 24 was a record high yielding year for lots of people. I don't think they've announced what they feel the statewide average was for Illinois yields yet. That'll be coming out soon, but I'm very confident we will set a new state average record yield, at least in corn. I don't know if we will in soybeans. Soybeans will be probably close to some of the best years that we've had in the state. Corn will easily surpass the highest average yield we've ever had. And that's in spite of the fact that I would say across the state, on average, I think aphids probably took 10 bushel of yield away from the state average corn yield in Illinois. So however high it ends up being, whether it's 225 or 227 or 230 or 232 or whatever it ends up being, if aphids hadn't been an issue, I think you could have added 10 more bushel onto the average yield of Illinois. and that would be a scary high number. And we'll talk about scary high yield numbers a little bit more as we get along. So diseases were not a terrible issue in corn. Now, disease pressure in soybeans was more variable, and in some cases there were significant yield losses in soybeans due to diseases. And 2024 was a good reminder that there are diseases in soybeans other than Phytophthora, brown stem rot, SDS, white mold, and soybean cyst nematode. There are diseases that some people have never even heard of. There's diseases called stem canker. There's diseases called diporthy. There's a disease called zone lines. There's pod and stem blight. There's anthracnose. There's charcoal rot. And since Adam's on here this morning, I'd be remiss and not mention the soybean disease that's got everybody's attention in certain parts of the state. And Adam's territory is kind of the epicenter of this. A disease called red crown rot. You can hardly pick up anything about soybeans without somebody talking about red crown rot. And Adam typed it in there in the chat. And red crown rot is different pathogens than what cause crown rot in corn. It's related, same species or genera, but a different species of fusarium that's involved in red crown rot does have some similar tendencies to other diseases that we know, like crown rot in corn and SDS in soybeans. It does tend to be favored by early planting conditions. There's a lot. We've done some work on screening genetics for there are different levels of tolerance. It's just like any other new disease, like when tar spot was new in corn. Nobody had any idea, what products were good or bad against tar spot, because nobody had ever screened germplasm for tolerance to tar spot. So some of that work is just starting on red crown rot in soybeans. If you have no idea what it is, that's a good thing. And hopefully you have no idea what it is for several years, because the people that know what it is and know what it is because they've had it on their farm, it can be a devastating disease. It's worse than the only disease that I'm familiar with in soybeans that can be as devastating as red crown rot would be white mold. I've seen highly susceptible varieties to white mold yield less than 20 bushel when white mold is severe, and red crown rot can take 20, 30, 40 bushel of yield away from a field of beans as well. So it's a more damaging disease than SDS. It's new, so it's gets a lot of attention. If you look at a map of the counties in Illinois where it's been found, it's kind of spooky because it's been found in probably roughly half the counties in Illinois. Now there's only a handful. Pike County would probably be the worst. Adam can type in whether he would agree with that or not. There's pockets in the state where it's more prevalent, where it's there's a lot more fields with it, a lot more people have experienced it. It's been found in a lot of counties in isolated areas, but it hasn't really become prevalent enough that it's actually affecting the overall yield of soybeans in those areas. But if it ever gets, as common as other soybean diseases, I mean, it does have the potential to, let's see, to my knowledge, Pike has the most widespread issue so far. Okay, so yes, Adam confirmed that Pike County is, that was one of the places it was found first. And the way things typically works, where something starts is where it's the worst as it spreads across a larger area. And, people are trying to minimize the spread. I honestly don't think there's any way you're going to stop something from spreading in an agricultural system. It's a soil-borne pathogen, so it's not going to spread like tar spot does through spores flying through the air. But anything that moves soil, animals, erosion, wind, tires, tillage, equipment, anything that moves soil is going to move that pathogen. And if that pathogen can survive in a lot of different soil environments, it's eventually going to be everywhere, no matter how hard people try to keep from spreading it. So we need to do more work on it, more research on it, find genetics that are resistant to it, maybe find chemistries that can help suppress it. There are some seed treatments that have shown the ability to suppress it. Suppression would be the strongest term you could use. And even when we see a yield benefit from some of these treatments, the yield benefit is single digit bushels, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 bushels better yield, which would easily pay for the treatment. But if your beans are losing 30 bushel of yield because of a serious disease problem, and a treatment gives you 3 bushel of the 30 that you lost back, you're not going to be terribly excited by that. It's still a crop failure either way from a producer's perspective. So, a lot more work to be done. Maybe it won't become. At one point in time, we thought Asian soybean rust was gonna make it impossible to grow soybeans. We thought tar spot was going to make it impossible to grow corn. People who have suffered a 40 bushel yield hit from crown rot, feel that red crown rot could make it impossible to raise soybeans. And in some cases, in some fields where it has been a repeated issue, those growers have quit raising soybeans in those fields and have gone to managing corn on corn. Let's see. Adam says we have genetic and treatment screening trials protocols to try to help manage the impact of the disease. Yep. So good point, Adam. So a lot of work being done, not just by Bayer, but by other people as well, looking into that new and emerging soybean disease. And it was not, the diseases that I ran into this year that were impacting soybean yields were not red crown rot. Not that it wasn't there, not that it wasn't serious where it's bad, but on a number of acres being impacted, everything else on my list that I read off is impacting a lot more acres than red crown rot is today. So what's saving us from red crown rot is the small number of acres on a macro scale that are being impacted by it. The other soybean diseases that are more prevalent, more common, they may be less severe, but because they're impacting more acres, they're having a bigger impact on the state of Illinois soybean yield than is red crown rot. But the danger with red crown rot is if it does ever start to impact a significant number of acres, it's going to be a big deal. And it'll be a game changer as far as our ability to, achieve 60 and 65 bushel statewide average yields like we've been doing on a semi-regular basis. So, kind of related to some of the disease issues in soybeans, because some of those diseases that we had were related to stress during grain fill. A trend I saw pretty consistently, and I've gotten this comment from lots of growers, is reduced populations in soybeans, improved standability, and increased yield this year. So we have talked a lot over the years about how soybeans do not need to be planted as thick as most people generally plant them. And soybean seeding rates have been on a slow downward decline for the last 10 years. Some of that's just because of things we've learned. Some of that's because of seed treatments. Some of that's just people are getting more and more comfortable. You've been at 160, you drop it to 150 and everything's okay. You drop it to 140 and everything's okay. You drop it to 130 and everything's okay. You drop it to 120 and everything's still okay. And you just keep dropping. So, I would say 160 to 185 probably used to be the normal range of soybean seeding rates. For a lot of years, I'd say, 140 was kind of the norm. And, more and more people are experimenting with seeding rates below 140,000 seeds per acre. And, honestly, I think that's a good idea. And I think that's perfectly fine. And on really good productive soils, with good planting conditions and good planting equipment, 100,000 is probably fine. Most people are not comfortable going that low, but 110, 120 is becoming pretty common for guys for seeding rates. And some of our dealers that are used to selling a lot more seeds than that per acre, like, whoa, calm down there, don't go getting crazy on me. But it's a lot of people are uncomfortable lowering their soybean seeding rate because they're afraid they're going to have to replant. And I have said for years that planting an extra 10 or 20 or 30 or 40,000 seeds per acre is almost never going to keep you from replanting. Because when you lose a stand, you don't lose 10 or 20% of it. You lose 40 or 50 or 60% of it. And, in most cases, people that are worried about having enough plants to have a good stand, it's hard for me to convince growers to leave 80 or 90,000 plants, even though that's plenty. We don't need more than 80 or 90,000 plants out there to get good weed control and get maximum yields. But if you're used to looking at 140, 80 looks like crap, especially no-till in narrow rows early in the season when plants are small and you got all the residue out there. I mean, in some cases, a thin stand of beans doesn't look good until about the middle of July. And so people just don't like the way it looks. And so it's really hard to keep growers from going out and thickening up a stand of beans. And I don't know how many times I've had guys tell me that, they'll leave a check strip, or they'll only do the bad parts of the field, or, whatever. And somewhere out in the field, they'll end up with a side by side of where they thickened the population up versus where they didn't. And where they left it alone, even if they were uncomfortable leaving it alone, is almost always yields better than where they thickened it up. There's multiple reasons for that, but if you can live with a stand of beans, that is the right decision. Do not, thicken up a stand of thin beans just to make yourself feel better, because you're probably not doing anything good for the yield of your field. And even if the seed's free, and even if crop insurance is paying you to do it, you're probably going to cost yourself money, because if you lose 4 or 5 bushel of yield, free seed and a little bit of money from crop insurance ain't going to make up for losing 5 bushel of beans. Plus, you went to all the trouble to do it. Another thing that was very consistent in both crops, and we're going to continue to hammer on weed management. We've had a couple different episodes last year devoted to weed management. We're going to continue to talk about weed management versus weed control. We cannot just run out there and kill every weed anymore like we used to. And so it's not about controlling weeds. It's about managing weeds. It's about preventing them from becoming a problem, because in some cases, if you let them become a problem, we can't fix it at that point. So weed management is going to be something I'm going to continue to harp on. And one of the cornerstones of weed management is early post-emergence applications. And when I say early, I mean weeds that are 1 inch tall, 2 inches tall. The biggest weed you can find, maybe 3 inches tall. A lot of weeds so small that unless you're crawling around on your hands and knees, you might not even see them. Those fields that got sprayed, if somebody was nervous that they were too early, corn and beans both, those were the fields that stayed clean. Fields that you were timely on were okay. Fields that you were late on and you have that feeling, a little bit of a pang in your side going, oh, shoot, I should have been out here a couple of weeks ago. Those were the fields that we struggle with. Those are the fields that ended up getting late applications, off-label applications, by the way, and things that, we really shouldn't be doing. Not good weed management. So we need to move those applications up in both corn and soybeans. Regardless of what herbicide system you're in love with, they all work better when you spray early post. They all work better when you use a good residual program up front with multiple effective modes of action. They all work better when you put additional residual on post. They all work better when that additional post residual goes on before the pre-emergent residual quits working. And, we can get a perfectly clean field, which is what all of our growers want. But we got to be better weed managers than you had to be 10 years ago to get that perfectly clean field. Do we have to have a perfectly clean field for 100% yield? No, we don't. Do we have to have a perfectly clean field to keep somebody else from renting your farm and to help you sleep better at night and make your landlords happy? Unfortunately, in some cases we do, because we farm in Central Illinois, and there is no place else on this earth, as far as I'm concerned, that is more competitive and more concerned with how things look than Central Illinois. So unfortunately, an economical level of weed control isn't good enough for most of our producers. And that's to me a little bit sad. It should be good enough, but it's not, and that's the reality that we all face. So we talked a little bit about the dry June. So 3 years in a row, we have had the ability to experience what a dry June does to tar spot, and the most effective cultural control for tar spot, in my opinion, is a dry June. And I think June weather is a pretty good way for you to get a little bit of a glimpse at how big of a deal is tar spot going to be. And the years where the years where you plant early and you have a wet June and you have really good corn growing conditions through the month of June because you got plenty of moisture and you've got a crop that looks like $1,000,000 in late June and you've had 4, 5, 6 inches plus of rain in June, that's the year that you need to be loaded for bear against tar spot. And we had those conditions in certain pockets in Illinois this year, and they tended to be in southern Illinois. So southern Illinois had the worst tar spot they've ever seen. Southern Indiana had the worst tar spot they've ever seen. Matter of fact, I was talking to Rachel Willis a couple of days ago. Rachel's a colleague of mine just north of me. Her and Jim Donnelly cover the northern part of Illinois, which has suffered the most over the years from tar spot. Jim is, considered by some to be the godfather of tar spot, which he hates being the godfather of tar spot, by the way. But Jim's done a lot of work in tar spot. He is one of the foremost authorities in the industry on tar spot. And Rachel and Jim are actually being asked to go speak at some meetings in southern Indiana because southern Indiana experienced tar spot like they've never seen. And southern Indiana is freaked out that, we're never going to be able to grow good corn again because of tar spot. And that's not the case. After the 2015 growing season and the 2018 growing season and the 2021 growing season, parts of Illinois thought that they'd never be able to grow good corn again. But, it takes the right weather conditions to make tar spot bad. We've got products that can control it. We can manage it. I actually think tar spot is easier to manage than crown rot is. You can at least, if you want to, spend money and stop tar spot from impacting your crop. It's hard to spend money and stop crown rot from impacting your crop. So June weather, dry Junes are, dry June's good. How many of you have heard the old, the old farmers saying that, dry June makes good corn? And there's a lot of agronomic reasons why that's true. A dry June doesn't mess up your nitrogen. A dry June doesn't restrict your root growth. A dry June reduces foliar disease pressure. There's a lot, and the corn plant is not really doing anything super stressful when it comes to setting its yield potential in June. It can set its yield potential just fine, being a little short on water in June. And if you got a choice between the 3 summer months, June, July, and August, which one do you want to be dry? That's easy. It's June every time. July is the worst month to be dry. August is the second worst month to be dry. June is the best time to be dry. May's a pretty good time to be dry as well. So, if we're dry April, May, June, and then you turn on the spigot and you get ample rainfall July and August, that equals perfect growing season. We have had years that, 2023 was this way in some cases, 22 was this way in some cases, where we were actually so dry April, May, and June, we had rootless corn. We had problems with emergence. If you planted too shallow, you had seeds laying in dry soil. It is really, really weird for Illinois to be that dry early in the growing season. So typically Illinois suffers a lot more from being too wet than we do from being too dry. And that's especially true early in the growing season. Now, as we get later in the growing season, it's more common for, too dry to be more of an issue than too wet. But, starting off the year a little on the dry side and staying dry up till late June, early July, and then getting wet through July and September, that's a recipe for great yields, frankly. And we've had a couple growing seasons here lately where that's essentially what happened, and that's partially the reason we've had such good yields. So this is nothing new. This next thing I'm going to say, but nitrogen availability was definitely impacted by weather events. So we had some areas of the state that had 12 inches of rain in July. We had areas that had 6 inches of rain in July. I don't know that there was anywhere in the state that had below average July rainfall. Average July rainfall for most of Illinois is going to be 4 point some inches, somewhere around 4.5 inches. I think the drier parts of the state had 5 or 6 inches of rain in July. The wetter parts of the state had 11 or 12 inches of rain in July. There's no good way to get 11 or 12 inches of rain in a month. Even in July and August, that is not helpful. Now it's better than a drought, but it's not as good as more moderate levels of rainfall. So when it's too wet, the impact on nitrogen is multiple fold. So depending on your soil type, depending on how much tile you've got in the field, too wet's going to impact nitrogen either through denitrification or through leaching. And even if you don't lose your nitrogen, your roots cannot function in an anaerobic environment. That's why, if you've ever wondered, why do so many people love drainage tile? Why are so many producers convinced that one of the best ROIs they can have on their farm is tile drainage? It's because a good pattern tile system reduces the number of days through the growing season that excess moisture or saturated soils are negatively impacting your crop. And the fact is, when you're farming in central Illinois, which is generally heavy soils, generally flat, generally naturally poorly drained, and generally we have abundant rainfall, we are oftentimes too wet. I don't know how many days out of an average growing season the crop is suffering because the soil is too wet, but I would guess in a normal year it's more than 30 days. And in a wet year, it might be more like 60 or 75 days. And every day that you can, have good soil conditions versus saturated soil conditions is a good day for that crop. And so we definitely saw, more issues with yield problems and nitrogen availability issues where it was excessively wet in April. And we had two wet months out of this growing season. For some people, April was 150% or more of normal average rainfall. And for some people, July was 200% or more of normal average rainfall. Other than April and July, it was a dry year. But we were so wet in April and July that more than offset how dry we were in the other months in the growing season. So in a lot of cases, and I went through this in an episode last year, I took 4 different farms that ironically had almost exactly the same amount of rainfall during the growing season if you went from April through September. But the distribution of that rainfall was very, very different. And the quality of the crop was very, very different across those farms just based on the distribution of the rainfall. So we more often have a problem with the distribution of rainfall than we do the amount that we get. You can raise some hellishly good crops with a lot less than normal rainfall if it comes at the right time. We don't need 30 inches of rain during the growing season to raise a good crop. 15 will do it if you get it at the right time. And if you can get it at the right time, in lesser amounts, that's going to be better than getting the extra that we typically do, because you can only hold so much moisture. You can't store up a year's worth of moisture. People worry about dry springs and they worry about subsoil moisture and they worry about lots of things. I would rather be dry and count on timely rains than have excess moisture, because excess moisture will not save you. Excess moisture in April and May is not going to do you any good in August, but it's doing you a lot of harm in April and May. So excess moisture is for us in the central part of Illinois is typically, way more of a boogeyman than being dry. So let's see. We talked about the old adage of the grain markets, rain makes grain, right? And when your crop's getting flooded and getting ruined by moisture, you get pretty irritated that the market goes down every time it rains, and you think, well, that rain makes grain thing's kind of BS. Well, it is true that too much rain, on a macro scale, is better than not enough. And when you get, there are more acres in the Corn Belt that suffer from drought stress than there are that suffer from flooding. So typically speaking, when it's wetter than you want it to be, yes, there's some acres that are getting negatively impacted by that, but there's more acres that are benefiting from that than there are that are getting hurt by that. But there's kind of the way I would put it is, too much rain in July is better than not enough, but the right amount is a lot better than too much. And some of you had too much rain in July, and that was more damaging to the late planted corn than it was to the early planted corn, because the late planted corn was still trying to grow, still trying to develop, still trying to set its yield potential in July. The early planted corn had already pollinated, already had a good year on it, was not taking up, so the late planted corn in July was taking up the maximum amount of nitrogen, it would through its lifetime every day through the month of June or the month of July. And if during the month of July, it couldn't access nitrogen, either because it was too wet, it had lost nitrogen, had saturated soils, whatever, that had more of a negative impact on that crop than the early planted corn, which was not really needing that much nitrogen, during the month of July, because it was already fully grown. The corn takes up the highest accumulating rate of nitrogen on a daily basis when it's in the late vegetative growth stages. The late planted corn was in late vegetative growth stages through the month of July. The early planted corn was in late vegetative growth stages in late June and early July. And so if you were too wet in July, that had a lot more of a negative impact on the crop that was still growing vegetatively than it did on the crop that was only growing reproductively. So talk about fungicides a little bit. So some of you won't like this statement, but I think this is true more often than not. I think with fungicides, you get what you pay for. If you're using a 3 mode of action product that has newer chemistry and better chemistry in it, you might be spending $25 an acre for that product, but it has a lot more potential to increase the yield of your crop than a $15 an acre product does that's only got 1 or 2 modes and has older chemistry in it. We've also seen very clearly, I've talked about this many times on Ask the Agronomist, we're going to continue to do more work to prove this. Not only do better products perform better, higher rates perform better. So I think in a lot of ways, I think if you're investing in a good fungicide program, and I'm going to call a good fungicide program, I won't name any names, but a good fungicide program is a high rate of a premium product. I get lots of questions from growers about, well, what's better? A standard rate of a good product or a high rate of a poorer product? That's a coin flip there. I'd say a high rate of the poorer product might be better in some cases with what I'm seeing in the way of rate responses. But I think the high rate of the good product is the best. And we can talk about timing. We can talk about how many times. We can talk about, do we do a V5? When's the best time for the R1? Do we need an R3 following the R1? Those are all kind of, it depends, conversations. A V5 application is the cheapest one to make. It doesn't have as much benefit as the R1 application, and it sure as hell does not replace the need for the R1 application. And I keep saying, R1, that window is VT, which is tassel, to R1, which is green silk. I don't want to see any fungicide going out on brown silk. And I know some of you are going to disagree with that. Some of my competitors are going to disagree with that. Other people supporting other brands might disagree with that. But if you want to know from our perspective, when is the best time to put your main shot of fungicide on your corn crop, it's going to be somewhere between tassel emergence and green silk. And that's as matter of factly as I can put that. There are situations where there is a benefit to another application later than that. It is almost never beneficial to wait to that later time to put on your first application. So the main application needs to be between tassel emergence and green silk. And then we can, about 3 weeks later, reassess if we need another shot. And that's going to depend on, for me, what I like to do is I like to go find some unsprayed corn. And if you find some unsprayed corn that's at the same stage of growth as your corn, and it looks so beautiful, you're wishing you had not sprayed your corn, then that's a pretty good indication you don't need that second shot. If you go find that unsprayed corn and it's a dumpster fire and you're going, man, I'm glad I sprayed my corn, you need to spray your corn again. And that to me is a better system than using spore sensors or sniffers or watching the weather. Or the weather's important. The weather's going to determine whether that unsprayed corn looks healthy, as it did this year. This year, if you went out 3 weeks after you sprayed your corn at VT and looked at somebody's corn that hadn't been sprayed, it was clean as a pin. And that was a good indication that we were not going to have heavy enough tar spot pressure to justify that second app. Now, some parts of the state did. So Adams Territory, they saw some 15, 20 bushel yield increases out of those sequential R3 applications. Well, they had a lot more tar spot pressure. There were unsprayed fields in south central Illinois, I'm going to say like I-72 corridor and south, that died a month early from tar spot, without a lot of crown rot pressure, without a lot of other stuff going on. It was just tar spot. So there were some isolated areas where tar spot was very bad, and people had the worst tar spot they've ever seen. Northern Illinois did not. Central Illinois did not. Southern Illinois did. Southern Indiana did. And if you look at rainfall patterns, those were the areas that got more rain in June. The parts of the state that were dry in June, kind of a non-issue. The parts of the state that were wet in June, and we've seen this consistently. So I really think watching your June weather close is a good canary in the coal mine for, how worried should I be about tar spot. So another thing that I observed this year, and we've known this to be true. This has always been true. This always will be true. You don't really want your success to be dependent on August weather, because what is normal August weather? It's too hot and too dry. Too hot and too dry, not good for yield. So one of the reasons that early planting was so good this year was August was too dry. There are a lot of places that only had an inch of rain in August, which is half a normal. And that 12 inches that they got in July, half of that ran off, and that does more harm than good. So even though there were lots of places where they had 11 inches in July, an inch in August, and an inch in September. So 14 inches over that 3-month time span is more than average rainfall. But it didn't work out that great for them, because they got too much in July, not enough in August, not enough in September. And really normal August weather is not conducive to maximum yields. And that's one of the main reasons that earlier planted crops, had an advantage this year, was because that August weather was too dry. Another thing that was a reminder from this growing season, and on multiple crops and at multiple times of the year, scouting for insects is still important. We plant a lot of traded corn. We plant a lot of traded beans. We don't typically make a lot of applications to control insects, but some years we need to. And this was one where we needed to for multiple reasons. So started off with alfalfa weevil. Worst alfalfa weevil damage I've ever seen. Worst stink bug damage I've ever seen in corn. A lot of stink bug damage is getting misdiagnosed out there as other issues. I'm not saying that we need to be spraying for stink bugs, but there are situations where had we been able to predict it, and had we got the timing right, and had we controlled stink bug before they damaged our crop, it would have absolutely more than paid for itself. Obviously, the insect that got all the attention in 24 turned out to be the corn leaf aphid, and I would say that 2024 probably was the worst corn leaf aphid year I've ever seen in my 30 plus year career. My expectation is those years are going to happen once about every 25 years, and good chance I'll be dead before we have the next bad aphid year again. But we need to be vigilant. We learned this year that if you're going to spray for aphids, those applications need to be made before tassel. If you're going to scout for aphids, you need to be pulling whorls and unwrapping whorls and looking for aphids down in the whorl, because by the time the plant is covered with aphids and you can see it walking down the corn row without really paying much attention, game's over at that point. Those plants have already aborted their ear. They've already been stressed to the point where they're basically going to be a weed. And you can kill lots of aphids at that stage of the game, but you can't protect much yield at that stage of the game. So if we're going to treat for aphids, it needs to be earlier. It probably needs to be a separate application than your fungicide, because I don't really want to put fungicides on pre-tassel. But pre-tassel is the right time for aphids. So we're lucky that aphids are very rarely an issue for us, because managing them is going to be expensive, and managing them is not easy. And we like things that are easy and inexpensive. And so we're fortunate that most years, year in and year out, aphids are a non-issue for us. There hasn't been anything change in aphid biology that made them worse. It was just a fluke thing. I think the mild winter. I'm loving this colder, harder winter that we're having here this year. We got some good cold weather coming up. We northern half of the state basically has no snow cover. So if we stay, relatively dry and cold, we're going to get some good freezing. We had, lots of areas that it really never froze last year, because the only times it was cold, we had 6 inches of snow on the ground, and that was a pretty good insulator. So I'm not an entomologist. I don't have any proof of this, but I got to think the unusually mild winter we had a year ago was somewhat to blame for the heavy population of multiple different insects that we experienced in 2024. So a good cold winter not gonna hurt my feelings any. Another thing that we observed, and this also is not news to you, but it happened probably more common this year because of our fall weather. The fall weather was just extremely dry, pretty warm, and very low humidity. And it was a good reminder that harvesting 8% soybeans and 13% corn is something we need to try to avoid if we can. Now it's hard to do, when you got 2,000 acres that's already about the same time. Something's going to get too dry on you, and we can only harvest so fast. You can only have so many combines. You can only have so many grain carts. You can only have so many grain trucks. Your grain dryer can only be so big. A lot of us can't handle 30% corn during harvest. And so, we can plant a wider range of maturities, which I certainly recommend. We got a 106-day corn hybrid that is absolutely out freaking standing. And we've got a lot of people that are for the first time going to plant some early corn, so that they got some acres that they can get out of the way 2 or 3 weeks before the bulk of their corn acres are ready. The early bean craze has, is still going strong. And so we've got guys planting, late group 2s in March and first week of April. And you can cut some beans pretty early if you're willing to plant early beans early. So getting more acres that we can harvest more timely, You may sacrifice some yield doing that, but you're going to gain yield by being more timely on harvesting a lot of your fuller season acres. And so, in the end, you might not lose any yield across your entire operation by planting that early stuff, even if it does yield a little bit less, because it enables you to be more timely. And just from a logistical workload standpoint, we got a lot of work we got to get done. You can't plant everything to 3.6 and later soybeans and 116 and later corn, because it's going to be the middle of October before you can start your harvest. And then you're going to have a hard time getting your fall work done, and you might potentially be harvesting later into the fall than you would ideally like to be. So genotype by environment interactions are certainly real. I mean, that's really what corn breeders have been trying to do for decades, and that is minimize the variability and performance of corn and soybeans based on the interaction between the genotype and the environment. But there's never going to be anything that eliminates that interaction between genotype and environment. And as the environment changes from year to year, that's going to impact the performance of products. And products that just were not ideally adapted or suited to the particular environment that Mother Nature threw at them this year struggled. Products that were more adapted to the environment that Mother Nature threw at them this year tended to flourish. And if a product wasn't having a problem this year, it probably achieved a record yield on your farm. The products that did have problems this year might still have achieved a record average yield on your farm, but they were 20 or 30 or 40 bushel off of the products that weren't having problems this year. I would say this is probably the first year in my career I've gotten some serious ass chewings over 260 plus bushel corn that yielded 30 bushels less than something else, and somebody was wanting their other 30 bushels. And if you're honest, I mean, some of you, I would ask you, what was your lowest yielding field of corn? My lowest yielding field of corn was about 220. And that's pretty damn low for this year. Some of you would say, honestly, your lowest yielding field of corn might have been north of 250. And you were pretty disappointed in your lowest yielding field of corn at 253 relative to 280, 290. There were some honest 300 field average yields out there. And just a good illustration. And I've made this point before. This year is going to illustrate this. I'll be really curious to see where the U.S. average comes in with today's hybrids and today's management and today's technology, and how fast we can put the crop in, how good a job we can do putting the crop in, how good a job we can do managing the crop, and the yield potential of today's genetics. If you give the entire U.S. corn growing region relatively good yield or weather, we are not far away from an average U.S. corn yield of 200. We're probably going to be in the upper 180s this year, I would guess, when it's all said and done. And there were some areas that were, really bad this year. I don't know what the Illinois average is going to end up being, but talk to people. If everybody you talk to, the worst corn they had was 220, 225, 230, that's the bottom. The average is going to be north of the bottom. And there's very little sub 200 bushel corn anywhere in the state of Illinois this year. Yes, there's some fields that get ruined by wildlife. There's some fields that were ruined by wind. One of the points I made here was yet another year to prove that wind insurance has a better ROI than federal crop does. There's a lot of guys that are really benefiting from wind coverage in corn. And I'm a big believer in that. I mean, there's a lot of genetics. We don't sell the stuff that is highly, highly susceptible to green snap, but there's a lot of acres every year that has the potential to suffer from green snap if you get a wind at the right stage. Harvestability can be affected, yield can be affected. It's to me a good practice to have some sort of wind protection, on your corn crop, and we're seeing that year in and year out. There's enough acres impacted by wind that it makes that a good management decision. We talked about that, yet another year that proves every year is different. And that's a good illustration of why, doing, generally speaking, whether it's grain marketing, hybrid selection, fertility management, whatever category you want to look at, doing next year what you should have done this year generally is not what will produce the best results, because next year is going to be different than this year. And I drew this map up here, and you might be wondering why I took the time to draw that and never use it. If you can make it out, that's the state of Illinois. This would be Iowa. This would be Missouri. This would be Indiana for the geographically challenged in the audience. And let's say this X here marks your farm. So when I look at data of seed products, corn, soybeans, doesn't matter. This is kind of a geography that I look at when I'm interested in looking at Central Illinois. And all of those dots there are representing plots where, product A was compared to product B, C, D, E, F, G, on down the line. And this plot might have been from 2022. And this one might have been from 2024. And this one might have been from 2023. So generally speaking, unless it's a brand new product, you should be able to get at least 3 years of performance data from your seed supplier on a product. And that's a pretty good geography to look at if you're looking, if you're trying to make decisions on your farm in Central Illinois. I would much rather look at 1,000 data points over 3 years across that geography than 3 fields right next to yours. So, and the reason I feel that way is because the environment's going to be different. The environment where that X is not going to be the same next year. Next year, your environment might be the same as this one was 2 years ago, or it might be the same as this one was 2 years ago, or it might be the same as this one was 2 years ago. So looking at a handful of plots or a handful of side-by-sides from your farm or adjacent farms to you, or if you feel better about, well, I only want to look at yields from my county. The problem with that is the weather is going to be different in all those spots next year. And that's why taking a bigger picture look, looking at multiple years, looking at as many locations as you can. Now, I don't use national data. You could use data from the whole country. I don't do that a lot because, it's enough different in Nebraska and Ohio. I don't know that I need to look at their data. But there's absolutely a good, especially for me over here in West Central Illinois, I got to look at data out of Eastern Iowa. I got to look at data from Northeastern Missouri. I want to look at data across most of Illinois. And that's the geographic area that I pull. And it's because, the genetics and the environment interaction, and the environment's going to change. So I think that's two other things I want to mention. I know we're at time, so appreciate those of you that made it, survived all the way to the end. Our Yield Chaser Banquet, Adam's probably gone. I hope I get this right. I should have looked this up. I think it's February 5th. So if you entered Yield Chasers, you want to come to the banquet, talk to your dealer, talk to your FSR, make sure you're getting your RSVP turned in for our Yield Chaser Banquet. We're going to have a good speaker. We're going to have a good meal. It'll be a good time. We'll give out some prizes. We'll celebrate our winners. I really like that Yield Chaser program. It's kind of a, we have a lot of producers that participate in NCGA, and we have a lot of success with our DeKalb brand in NCGA, and we're very proud of that. And we promote NCGA a lot, but it's a lot of work. So we really encourage people to, if you want to participate in the NCGA contest, we will help you with that. If you, want to do kind of something a little easier than that, that's just kind of for fun, that's what Yield Chasers is. So we offer both. We encourage participation in both. The bar is a little higher as far as the requirements go to participate in NCGA. So every NCGA entry will easily qualify for Yield Chasers, but you got to do a little more to get into NCGA than you do to participate in Yield Chasers. but we'll have our banquet coming up. I'm pretty sure it's February 5th. I apologize to Jennifer and Zach if I got the date wrong. And then the next episode of Ask the Agronomist is going to be 2 weeks from today, which is January 23rd. And I can't announce this yet. I'm just going to give a little bit of a teaser. I hope to have a very special guest with me on that next episode in 2 weeks, and we'll get that confirmed prior to that episode. And if I don't have this gentleman on with me in 2 weeks, I'm going to have him on with me sometime this year, and hopefully he'll be able to join me in a couple weeks. But that's just a little bit of a teaser for you. So I appreciate all your attention here this morning. Appreciate those of you that logged in live. Thanks for being in the chat. And everybody have a great day. Stay safe. We'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Take care.